Today, I stand before you to discuss a man whose name has become synonymous with opposition, arrogance, and defiance. Abu Jahl, or Amr ibn Hisham. To many, Abu Jahl is nothing more than a villain in the early history of Islam, a staunch enemy of Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, and the Muslims. But beyond the titles of enemy of Islam or the Pharaoh of this ummah, there lies an untold story, one that sheds light on the complexities of his personality, his actions, and his role in the broader context of early Islamic history. Abu Jahl was not just an ordinary enemy of the Prophet, PBUH. He was a leader among the Quraysh, one of the most powerful and respected tribes in Mecca. His wealth, status, and influence made him a figure of authority, but these very attributes also fueled his resistance to Islam. While the Prophet Muhammad, public Muhammad, preached a message of monotheism and equality, Abu Jahl saw it as a direct threat to his power, prestige, and the established order of his society. Abu Jahl's opposition to Islam wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Despite witnessing the miracles and witnessing the truth of Islam, his arrogance and tribal pride led him to resist. He not only sought to harm the Prophet, PBUH, but also made it his mission to suppress Islam by any means necessary. He led the campaign against the early Muslims, forcing them into economic and social isolation. In the time before Islam, the Quraysh held power in Mecca, and Abu Jahl was among its most influential leaders. His opposition wasn't merely based on religious grounds, it was also about preserving his social status and the dominance of the Quraysh over other tribes. His authority in Mecca made him a formidable foe to the Prophet Muhammad and the nascent Muslim community. What made Abu Jahl so resolutely opposed to Islam? To understand this, we must look at the psychology behind his actions. His pride and arrogance blinded him to the truth, and his refusal to acknowledge the Prophet, PBUH, was based on the fear of losing his prestigious position in Mecca. His resistance to the truth was more about his ego than his intellect. One of the most significant episodes in Abu Jahl's campaign against the Muslims was his role in the economic and social boycott. The Quraysh, led by Abu Jahl, imposed harsh sanctions on the Muslims, cutting them off from trade, food, and it was a strategy of oppression intended to force the Muslims to give up their faith. But rather than weakening the resolve of the believers, it only made them stronger, and in the end, it helped spread the message of Islam even further. The Battle of Badr was a turning point in the early history of Islam. Abu Jahl, as the leader of the Quraysh army, led the opposition against the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, and his companion. His defeat in this battle was not just a military loss, but a spiritual one. His arrogance led him to underestimate the strength of the Muslims and the power of their faith, and his death in the battle symbolized the end of his resistance. Abu Jahl's personal animosity toward the Prophet Muhammad is a well-documented part of Islamic history. He was one of the most vocal critics, mocking the Prophet and attempting to harm him on numerous occasions. But despite the bitterness between them, the Prophet PBUH remained patient, never resorting to anger or violence, and always focused on his mission to spread the message of Islam. Abu Jahl's opposition to Islam can also be seen as a political maneuver. His primary fear was the loss of control over Mecca, over the Quraysh, and over the tribes in the region. To him, the rise of Islam represented a threat to his influence, and this fear drove him to take extreme measures to suppress the new religion. While history often paints Abu Jahl as an irredeemable villain, it is important to recognize that, like all humans, he had his own struggle. His decision to oppose Islam was not merely out of malice, but because of his deep attachment to his societal position. His story reminds us of how the human heart can be swayed by pride and fear, even in the face of truth. Despite his fierce resistance, Abu Jahl's actions played a pivotal role in the early expansion of Islam. His defiance led to the strengthening of the resolve of the Muslims, and his death marked the beginning of a new phase in the spread of Islam. The story of Abu Jahl serves as a reminder of the consequences of arrogance and the price one pays for refusing to humble oneself before the truth. Abu Jahl's life is a powerful lesson in human nature and the dangers of pride, arrogance, and fear. His untold story is not just one of opposition to Islam, but a reminder that history is shaped not only by its heroes, but also by its villains. In the end, the story of Abu Jahl reminds us of the importance of humility, faith, and the power of the truth. Abu Jahl, born Amr ibn Hisham, was a prominent and influential leader of the Quraysh tribe in Mecca, known for his deep opposition to the message of Islam. He was a man of significant status, wealth, and power, and was regarded as one of the most respected figures in pre-Islamic Arabia. As a member of the Quraysh elite, he held considerable sway over the social, political, and religious dynamics of Mecca. Abu Jahl's resistance to Islam was not merely rooted in theological differences, but also in his desire to protect his own position and the traditional social order of his tribe. His leadership role in Mecca made him one of the most formidable opponents to Prophet Muhammad and the early Muslim community. Though he was initially aware of the truth of the Prophet's message, his pride, arrogance, and the fear of losing his power prevented him from accepting Islam. He saw the new faith as a direct challenge to his authority, a threat to the established norms of the Quraysh, and an undermining of the status quo that placed him at the top of the societal hierarchy. This fear of losing his privileged position in the social order made him one of the most vehement detractors of the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH. His intense opposition included mockery, persecution, and physical harm toward the Muslims, demonstrating not just a rejection of their message, but a deep personal animosity toward the Prophet himself. Abu Jahl's story is intricately tied to the broader narrative of the early struggles of Islam, as he was one of the key figures who sought to stifle the message that was spreading throughout Mecca. His actions during the early years of Islam are often viewed as an embodiment of the extreme resistance to change and the fear of losing control over power and tradition. Despite witnessing the wisdom and miracles of the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, his arrogance and his vested interests in maintaining the dominance of the Quraysh tribe kept him resolute in his opposition. His status and influence in Mecca made him one of the most dangerous adversaries the Prophet faced during these early years, and his actions would go on to shape much of the conflict between the early Muslims and the Quraysh. Abu Jahl's opposition to Islam was both intense and multifaceted, deeply rooted in a mixture of personal pride, political fear, and a rigid commitment to the traditions of his people. He was not only a powerful leader of the Quraysh tribe, but also one who felt personally threatened by the rise of the new faith, the message of Islam, which emphasized monotheism, equality, and a rejection of the tribal polytheism and hierarchical social structures, challenged the very foundations of his power. As a member of the Quraysh elite, Abu Jahl's status was intertwined with the religious and political customs of the tribe, and the idea of surrendering that control to a new foreign religion was something he could not fathom. Abu Jahl's opposition to the Prophet Muhammad went beyond mere disagreement. It was marked by an aggressive stance aimed at quashing the message of Islam. He resorted to mocking the Prophet, belittling his teachings, and spreading lies about him in an attempt to discredit his message in the eyes of the people. His tactics were intended to isolate Muhammad and his followers, making them appear as outcasts, misfits, or even lunatics. In addition to verbal assaults, Abu Jahl was a key figure in organizing the physical persecution of the early Muslims. He was involved in the social and economic boycott imposed on the Muslims, which sought to break their resolve by depriving them of food, trade, and shelter. His cruelty toward the poor and oppressed, like Bilal ibn Rabah, and his efforts to make life unbearable for the Muslims were designed to force them into abandoning their faith. Abu Jahl also took part in several failed attempts to physically harm the Prophet Muhammad. PBUH. He was one of the main figures responsible for the constant harassment and intimidation that the Prophet endured, particularly in the early days of Islam when the Muslim community was still small and vulnerable. He even went so far as to call for the death of the Prophet, organizing plans to stop him from spreading his message. What made Abu Jahl particularly dangerous was his ability to rally the Quraysh against Muhammad. PBUH. Appealing to their collective fear of losing their dominance and the social order they had maintained for centuries. His opposition was not simply based on religious belief, but was also driven by a deep fear of losing the power and influence he held over the people of Mecca. Despite the growing number of people who were embracing Islam, Abu Jahl remained defiant, convinced that the message would ultimately be a threat to his tribe and his leadership. His refusal to see the truth of Islam was a reflection of his stubborn pride and his inability to accept that a man from his own tribe, one who was once seen as an orphan with no significant lineage, could be the chosen messenger of God. In his mind, this would be a humiliation for the Quraysh, and he could not accept that. Even as he witnessed the miracles performed by the Prophet Muhammad and the wisdom of his words, Abu Jahl's arrogance prevented him from admitting that Islam was the truth. Instead, he doubled down on his opposition, seeking to extinguish the message of Islam by any means necessary. Abu Jahl's opposition to Islam stands as a poignant reminder of the lengths to which individuals will go to protect their status and authority, even when faced with the undeniable truth. His personal animosity toward the Prophet Muhammad and his relentless efforts to persecute the Muslims reveal the power of pride and fear in clouding one's judgment. He not only failed to recognize the message of Islam, but he also fought against it with all the strength and resources at his disposal, leaving behind a legacy of bitter opposition that would only end with his defeat. In pre-Islamic Mecca, Abu Jahl was a man of immense stature and influence, holding a position of leadership within the Quraysh tribe. The Quraysh were not just any tribe. They were the custodians of the Kaaba, the sacred house of worship, and held significant political, social, and economic power in the Arabian Peninsula. Mecca itself was a major center of trade, religion, and pilgrimage, drawing people from all parts of Arabia and beyond. As a member of the Quraysh, Abu Jahl was born into one of the most respected families in the city, and his heritage and social standing granted him access to the highest echelons of power. He was a figure of authority both within his tribe and among the other tribes of Arabia, known for his wealth, eloquence, and sharp political acumen. His status was not simply a matter of birthright, but also the result of his personal capabilities and actions. Abu Jahl's role as a leader was defined by his fierce defense of the traditional ways of the Quraysh. The tribe's social structure, centered around polytheism, tribalism, and the supremacy of its aristocracy, was something Abu Jahl not only upheld, but actively fought to preserve. He was a protector of the status quo, believing that any challenge to the existing order would bring chaos and threaten the stability of his society. His influence was particularly evident in matters related to the Kaaba, the pilgrimage, and the broader political affairs of Mecca. As a powerful figure, Abu Jahl had the ability to shape decisions and influence the direction of the tribe. His actions were always aligned with his interests in maintaining the Quraysh's dominance and the privilege it afforded him. In a city where power and reputation were often measured by wealth, lineage, and the ability to command respect, Abu Jahl's status was unmatched. He was a member of the Makhzum clan, one of the most prominent branches of the Quraysh, and this lineage was a source of pride and influence. His family's connections and his personal reputation as a strong leader made him a key figure in Mecca's political and social circles. People looked to him for guidance, and his decisions carried weight. especially when it came to matters that affected the economic and religious interests of the Quraysh. Abu Jahl's position in Mecca also meant that he was acutely aware of any potential threats to his authority. As a tribal leader, he had to balance the interests of the powerful Quraysh elite with the broader population. This delicate balance meant that Abu Jahl was constantly navigating complex social and political landscapes, and any challenge to the established norms was seen as a direct affront to his power. When the message of Islam began to spread, it posed a serious threat not just to the religious practices of the Quraysh, but to the very fabric of their social hierarchy. For Abu Jahl, the rise of Islam represented a direct challenge to everything he had worked to maintain. It was not simply a new religion. It was an existential threat to his way of life, his power, and the control he exercised over Mecca. Abu Jahl's influence in pre-Islamic Mecca was not limited to his immediate circle. He was one of the key figures in the Quraysh Council and played a pivotal role in making decisions that affected the wider city. His voice carried considerable weight in the deliberations of the tribe, and he was often at the forefront of decisions that were made to protect the interests of the Quraysh against external and internal challenges. His wealth also gave him the means to sponsor initiatives that supported his position, whether through financial backing of anti-Islamic campaigns or the ability to rally others in opposition to the Prophet Muhammad. PBUH. In Mecca's hierarchical society, Abu Jahl epitomized the values of aristocracy and tradition. His identity was tied to the glory of his tribe, and his fear of losing that status drove many of his actions. The power he wielded as a leader of the Quraysh was unmatched, and this made his opposition to Islam even more formidable. His leadership role and the respect he commanded within the tribe positioned him as a key figure in the broader struggle between the Quraysh and the early Muslim community, and his status in Mecca made him a symbol of the tribal resistance to change. His sense of self-preservation and his unwillingness to accept the rise of a new order under Islam were rooted in his firm belief that the existing societal framework was not only right but essential for maintaining peace and prosperity in Mecca. Abu Jahl's psychological profile reveals a man deeply entrenched in pride, ego, and a profound sense of entitlement. He was driven by a relentless desire to maintain his status and position of power, which were firmly rooted in his lineage, wealth, and social standing within the Quraysh tribe. His sense of self-worth was inextricably linked to his status as a leader, and the prospect of losing that position to a new movement was something he could not tolerate. At the core of his personality was an unshakable belief in the superiority of his tribe, the Quraysh, and the way of life they upheld. This belief was so strong that he viewed any challenge to his authority as a direct insult not only to his personal dignity, but also to the very fabric of Meccan society, which had long been built on tribal hierarchies and polytheistic practices. Abu Jahl's arrogance was one of his most defining traits. He saw himself as part of a privileged class, born into a respected family with long-standing influence in Mecca. This sense of superiority clouded his judgment and led him to dismiss the message of Islam despite its undeniable logic and the miracles that surrounded Prophet Muhammad. MBVU. His pride prevented him from even considering the possibility that someone from a humble background, like the Prophet, could be the chosen messenger of God. For Abu Jahl, it was not just about rejecting a new religious message. It was about protecting the hierarchical structure that gave him power and control. To accept Islam would have meant dismantling the social system he had long benefited from, and this was a threat he could not bring himself to acknowledge. At the same time, Abu Jahl's fear of losing his status was just as powerful as his arrogance. He feared the destabilization of the power dynamics that the Quraysh controlled, and he believed that the rise of Islam would bring about an end to the economic and social systems that sustained him and his tribe. This fear turned into an obsessive need to suppress the spread of Islam at any cost. His antagonism toward Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, was not just religious or ideological. It was a personal and existential conflict. The Prophet's message, which called for the rejection of idols and the establishment of a universal monotheism, threatened to overturn the very foundations of Abu Jahl's identity and authority. His sense of control over Mecca was so integral to his sense of self that he viewed the Prophet Muhammad's, PBEO, rise as a personal affront. Abu Jahl's actions were often guided by his intense need to preserve his social and political dominance. He was not a mere ideologue. He was a shrewd and calculating leader who understood the importance of public perception and influence. His efforts to discredit and oppose Islam were strategic, aimed at preserving his position not only within the Quraysh tribe, but in the broader context of Meccan society. He was a master of manipulation, using his position to turn public opinion against the Prophet and his followers, and resorting to tactics such as mockery, intimidation, and economic sanctions. By creating a narrative that painted the Muslims as rebels and outsiders, he sought to weaken their support base and isolate them from the rest of the community. Despite the fact that Abu Jahl was a man of intellect and political insight, his inability to humble himself or confront the possibility that he might be wrong was a fatal flaw. His refusal to acknowledge the truth of Islam, even when faced with compelling evidence, was a testament to the power of his ego. He saw submission to a higher truth as a sign of weakness, something that would erode the control he had carefully cultivated over the years. This pride made him resistant to any form of spiritual growth, as he believed that accepting the Prophet's message would diminish his authority and prestige. Abu Jahl's behavior was also marked by an overwhelming sense of superiority, which led him to view the early Muslims as inferior and unworthy of respect. He considered the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, as naive, misguided, and beneath him, particularly the poor and enslaved individuals among them. His disdain for the Prophet and his followers was rooted in this deep sense of class and social hierarchy, which made him dismissive of any challenge to the Quraysh's traditional structure. His psychological attachment to the power dynamics that had long been in place blinded him to the possibility that the new faith could provide a path to justice, equality, and true spiritual fulfillment. In many ways, Abu Jahl's psychological profile illustrates the dangers of unchecked pride and the fear of losing power. His inability to overcome his pride, coupled with his fear of losing control, led him down a path of obstinate defiance against Islam, even in the face of mounting evidence and growing support for the Prophet's message. His psychological makeup reveals the complex relationship between personal ambition, social power, and the resistance to change, and it serves as a cautionary tale of how ego and fear can prevent individuals from embracing truth when it challenges the foundations of their self-approval. Abu Jahl played a central role in the harsh economic and social boycott imposed on the early Muslims by the Quraysh tribe. The boycott, which took place in the early years of the Prophet Muhammad's PBU mission, was a calculated attempt by the Quraysh leadership to suppress the growing influence of Islam and force the Muslims into submission. Abu Jahl, as a powerful and influential figure within the Quraysh, was instrumental in orchestrating and enforcing this boycott, hoping that by isolating the Muslims, they would either be compelled to abandon their faith or be starved into submission. The boycott was not just a simple economic sanction. It was a brutal and systematic attempt to break the resolve of the Muslims and weaken the growing movement. The Quraysh, under the leadership of Abu Jahl, believed that the new religion posed a direct threat to their political, social, and religious authority in Mecca. The boycott was especially cruel because it targeted the Muslims' basic means of survival. The Quraysh, led by Abu Jahl, not only imposed trade restrictions on the Muslims, making it nearly impossible for them to access food or supplies, but they also cut off all social ties with them. no one was allowed to do business with the Muslims, and anyone who chose to support them was shunned. This left the early Muslim community, including Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, his family, and his followers, in a dire situation. For over 3 years, the Muslims were forced to endure extreme deprivation, with many having to live in a secluded area known as the Shib of Abu Talib, where they were cut off from the rest of the Meccan society. It was a time of great suffering for the Muslims, yet throughout this ordeal, Abu Jahl remained unyielding in his stance, believing that if the pressure on the Muslims grew severe enough, they would abandon their faith and return to the idolatry that was so central to the Quraysh way of life. Abu Jahl's role in the boycott was also a demonstration of his deep-rooted animosity toward the Prophet Muhammad. PBUH. For Abu Jahl, this was not merely a political strategy, it was a personal vendetta against the Prophet. Adam Smith. He saw the Prophet's growing influence as a threat not only to his own power, but to the entire social order that he had worked so hard to maintain. By supporting the boycott, Abu Jahl hoped to crush the morale of the Muslims and isolate the Prophet, Harold Smith, from any potential supporters. He believed that if the Muslims were isolated and deprived of their resources, they would be forced to give up their cause and embrace the traditional polytheism of the Quraysh. Despite the suffering and hardships the Muslims endured during this period, Abu Jahl's actions highlighted his inability to see beyond his own pride and sense of superiority. He refused to recognize the potential of Islam to create a more just and egalitarian society, dismissing it instead as a threat to the established order. He was unwilling to acknowledge the power of the message that Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, was spreading, and his efforts to stop its spread were driven by a deep fear of losing his position in Meccan society. For Abu Jahl, the boycott was not just about suppressing a rival belief system, it was about maintaining control over the people of Mecca and ensuring that the Quraysh remained the dominant force in the region. The economic and social boycott had a profound impact on the early Muslim community. It tested their faith in unity, and while many of the Muslims faced extreme hardship, their resolve remained strong. The suffering they endured during this time became a source of strength and solidarity. While Abu Jahl believed that the boycott would break the Muslims, it instead reinforced their commitment to the Prophet's message. The boycott would ultimately fail in its objective as Islam continued to spread and the Muslims began to gain more support from individuals who had previously been hesitant to align themselves with the new faith. Despite Abu Jahl's determination and influence, the boycott ultimately served to highlight the cruelty of the Quraysh leadership and the resilience of the Muslim community. Abu Jahl's role in the boycott is a testament to his unyielding opposition to the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, and his vision of a new social and religious order. It also underscores his deep attachment to the privileges and power he enjoyed as a member of the Quraysh elite. His leadership in enforcing the boycott reveals the lengths to which he was willing to go to protect his status and suppress any challenge to the existing social hierarchy. While the boycott inflicted great suffering on the Muslims, it also became a pivotal moment in the early history of Islam, symbolizing the strength of the Muslim community in the face of persecution and their unwavering commitment to their faith. Abu Jahl played a central and antagonistic role in the Battle of Badr, one of the most significant confrontations in the early years of Islam. His involvement in this battle was shaped by his intense opposition to the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, and the growing Muslim community. As one of the leading figures in the Quraysh, Abu Jahl was determined to crush the Muslims once and for all, not only to protect the political and economic dominance of the Quraysh, but also to avenge the growing influence of Islam, which he saw as a personal challenge to his authority. The Quraysh, under the leadership of Abu Jahl, mobilized a large army to face the Muslims, viewing the battle as a decisive moment to put an end to the Islamic movement and restore their control over Mecca and its religious traditions. In the months leading up to the Battle of Badr, Abu Jahl was a driving force behind the Quraysh's decision to confront the Muslims militarily. He was one of the chief instigators of the war, and his leadership was marked by a deep personal hatred for the Prophet Muhammad. PBUH. His primary motivation for going to battle was not just to suppress a new religious movement, but to protect his own position of power and prestige within Meccan society. The growing success of Islam, which had started to attract more followers and gain increasing influence in the Arabian Peninsula, was seen by Abu Jahl as a direct threat to the existing social order that had long been dominated by the Quraysh. To him, the Battle of Badr was not just a military engagement, but a fight for the very survival of his tribe's dominance and the preservation of their religious practices, centered around the idols of the Kaaba. On the battlefield, Abu Jahl took on the role of a commander, leading the Quraysh army with a fierce determination. He was not merely a figurehead, but an active participant in the battle's planning and execution. His arrogance and belief in his tribe's superiority drove him to underestimate the Muslims, whom he viewed as an insignificant, disorganized group of followers without the capacity to stand against the might of the Quraysh. Abu Jahl's confidence in his forces, as well as his belief that victory was certain, fueled his aggressive tactics and pushed him to take on the role of chief strategist, rallying his men with promises of glory and victory. He sought to motivate his troops by appealing to their tribal pride, urging them to fight with all their might to defend the honor and power of the Quraysh. When the battle finally commenced, Abu Jahl's leadership came into full focus. He was at the forefront, commanding his troops with relentless energy, and was eager to personally face the Prophet Muhammad and the battlefield. His personal animosity toward the Prophet Muhammad was evident in his eagerness to engage in the battle, viewing it as a personal vendetta. He believed that by defeating the Muslims and killing the Prophet, he would not only secure the Quraysh's dominance, but also destroy what he viewed as a direct challenge to the legacy of his tribe. Abu Jahl's defiance against the Prophet Muhammad was a crucial element in his participation in the battle, as it was not only about the survival of the Quraysh, but about his own personal sense of revenge. Despite his aggression and bold leadership, Abu Jahl's role in the Battle of Badr was ultimately one of failure and defeat. The Quraysh army, despite being much larger and better equipped, was defeated by the much smaller Muslim force. Abu Jahl's fate in the battle was sealed when he was killed by two young Muslim warriors, Muawiyah ibn Qurra and Abdullah ibn Masud. His death marked a pivotal moment in the battle and in the early history of Islam. Abu Jahl's death was symbolic, as he had been one of the most ardent and vocal opponents of the Prophet Muhammad and his message. The loss of such a prominent figure in the Quraysh ranks was not just a military defeat, but a severe blow to the morale of the Quraysh leadership. Abu Jahl's death at Badr signified the ultimate failure of his efforts to suppress Islam. It was a testament to the power of faith and the determination of the Muslim community in the face of overwhelming odds. His role in the battle highlighted his personal vendetta against the Prophet Muhammad. PBUH, his arrogance in underestimating the strength of the Muslims, and his deep-rooted desire to preserve the status quo that Islam was challenging. In the end, Abu Jahl's leadership and involvement in the Battle of Badr served as a stark reminder of how personal pride, combined with blind opposition to change, can lead to downfall, and how the victory of the Muslims symbolized the triumph of faith over worldly power and arrogance. The relationship between Abu Jahl and the Prophet Muhammad PBUH, was one of profound animosity shaped by a deep personal and ideological divide. Abu Jahl, as one of the most powerful and influential leaders of the Quraysh, viewed the rise of Islam as a direct threat to his authority, status, and the established social order in Mecca. He saw Muhammad not just as a religious figure, but as an individual who challenged the very foundations of Meccan society, which was built on polytheism, tribalism, and a strict hierarchical structure. The Prophet's message of monotheism and social justice undermined the power dynamics that Abu Jahl had spent his life consolidating, and he could not accept that someone from his own tribe, who had once been seen as an orphan and a non-entity, could now stand as a prophet and a leader of a growing movement. For Abu Jahl, the personal relationship with the Prophet Muhammad, initially Abu Jahl had been somewhat neutral toward Muhammad and his early message, as he did not immediately perceive the new religion as a significant threat. However, as Muhammad began to gain followers and his message spread, Abu Jahl's attitude turned into vehement opposition. He regarded the Prophet's call to abandon idol worship and submit to the one God as not just blasphemous, but as an insult to the religious practices of the Quraysh, who held the Kaaba and its idols in reverence. The Quraysh elites, led by Abu Jahl, feared that the Prophet's movement would undermine their control over Mecca, particularly as the city was a major religious and economic hub. As the Prophet Muhammad continued to spread Islam, Abu Jahl became one of the most vocal critics, using his considerable influence to disparage and delegitimize the Prophet. He mocked the Prophet's claim to divine revelation, calling him mad, deluded, and a liar. Abu Jahl was notorious for spreading rumors and lies about Muhammad, even going so far as to incite others to ridicule him. His words and actions were designed to damage the Prophet's credibility in the eyes of the Meccan public, portraying him as a disruptor of the established social order and a threat to the traditional ways of life. His opposition was not merely religious or philosophical, it was deeply personal. He viewed Muhammad as a challenge to his personal power and influence, and as a result, he became one of the most relentless persecutors of the Prophet and his followers. Abu Jahl also sought to intimidate the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, with physical violence. On several occasions, he attempted to harm or humiliate the Prophet. One of the most notorious incidents involved Abu Jahl leading an effort to physically assault Muhammad while he was praying in the Kaaba, hoping to humiliate him in front of the gathered Quraysh. These violent threats reflected Abu Jahl's desperation to suppress the growing influence of Islam, but they also exposed his underlying fear of Muhammad's power to inspire and mobilize others. His attitude toward the Prophet was a reflection of his deep-seated insecurity, as he saw the Prophet's message not only as a spiritual challenge, but as a political and social one as well. Despite Abu Jahl's constant attempts to undermine Muhammad, PBUH, the Prophet remained calm and resolute in his mission. He continued to preach his message of monotheism, patience, and justice, undeterred by the hostility of individuals like Abu Jahl. It is clear that the Prophet Muhammad did not view Abu Jahl as a personal enemy, but rather as a misguided individual who was blinded by pride, fear, and a desire for power. While Abu Jahl's antagonism was intense, the Prophet Muhammad, PBU, remained focused on his higher purpose and did not retaliate in kind, embodying the core values of mercy, compassion, and forgiveness that Islam promotes. The personal relationship between Abu Jahl and the Prophet Muhammad, PBU, became a symbol of the broader conflict between the Quraysh elites and the emerging Muslim community. Abu Jahl's hostility towards the Prophet was rooted in his fear of losing the political and social dominance that his tribe had enjoyed for generations. In his eyes, the Prophet was a threat not just to religion, but to the very structure of Meccan society. For the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, The conflict with Abu Jahl was not one of personal vendetta, but a struggle between truth and falsehood, between the message of justice and mercy, and the forces of oppression and pride. This relationship would ultimately end with the defeat of the Quraysh in the Battle of Badr, where Abu Jahl, as one of the leading figures of the Quraysh army, was killed. His death symbolized the downfall of the old order that he had worked so hard to preserve, while the victory of the Muslims in Badr marked a significant turning point in the early history of Islam. Despite their deep personal enmity, Abu Jahl's role in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, helped to solidify the determination of the Muslim community, showing that their faith could endure even in the face of the most powerful and vocal opposition. Abu Jahl's fear of losing power was a central driving force behind his relentless opposition to the Prophet Muhammad and the rise of Islam. Born into the prestigious Makhzum clan of the Quraysh, Abu Jahl's identity and sense of self-worth were inextricably linked to his social standing, wealth, and influence within Mecca. His fear was not just about losing status or wealth. It was about the complete dismantling of the established order that had granted him authority and control over his tribe and the city itself. For Abu Jahl, the Quraysh's power was built on their role as custodians of the Kaaba, the idol worship at its center, and their position as the leading tribe in the Arabian Peninsula. These pillars of power were deeply ingrained in the social and religious fabric of Mecca, and the rise of Islam threatened to upend everything he held dear. As the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, began preaching monotheism and social justice, Abu Jahl saw this as a direct challenge to the system that had given him his power. The message of Islam, which emphasized equality among people, the rejection of idols, and the dismantling of tribal hierarchies, threatened to undermine the very foundation of Quraysh dominance. If Islam were to spread, it would strip the Quraysh of their religious and political authority, rendering them just another tribe among many in the Arabian Peninsula, no longer the undisputed leaders of the region. For someone like Abu Jahl, whose entire identity was built on this elevated status, the fear of losing that power was immense. His position was not just political but personal, and the idea of being reduced to the status of an ordinary individual was inconceivable. This fear manifested itself in Abu Jahl's obstinate resistance to Islam. The more the Prophet Muhammad, at PBUH, gained followers and his message began to take hold, the more desperate Abu Jahl became. He understood that the threat of Islam was not just a religious one but an existential one to the power structures he was part of. He feared that the Quraysh's wealth, their position as the custodians of the Kaaba, and their influence over trade routes would all diminish if the people of Mecca turned to the new faith. Abu Jahl's fear of losing his power was compounded by his belief that Islam would not only weaken his tribe's position, but would also shatter the established social order. The tribe's prestige, which had been earned through their control over the Kaaba and their idol worship, would be destroyed, and this idea was intolerable to him. Abu Jahl's fear of losing power made him one of the most vocal and aggressive opponents of the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH. His actions were driven by an urgency to protect his social and political position, even if it meant resorting to cruelty and violence. The Quraysh leader did everything in his power to discredit the Prophet and intimidate those who followed him. He used his wealth and influence to launch smear campaigns against Muhammad, PW, calling him a liar, a madman, and an impostor. He sought to isolate the Muslims from the rest of Meccan society by pushing for a boycott that would cut them off from trade, sustenance, and social ties. In doing so, Abu Jahl hoped to force the Muslims into submission, believing that the harshness of the boycott would break their resolve and force them to abandon Islam. His ability to rally other Quraysh leaders and direct the tribe's efforts to oppose the Prophet was a direct reflection of his fear of Islam's growing influence. His fear extended beyond mere political power. It also encompassed his personal ego and legacy. Abu Jahl could not fathom that a man from a modest background like Muhammad could lead a movement that would challenge his life's work and the authority of his family. For him, it was not just about defeating the Muslims, it was about asserting his superiority over Muhammad and proving that his power was unquestionable. His reaction to Islam was thus deeply tied to his own insecurity and pride. To accept Islam would have meant to accept a paradigm shift, one where his status and his role in society would no longer be guaranteed. The Prophet's success was something he could not allow because it represented a reordering of the world he had known and thrived in. The culmination of Abu Jahl's fear of losing power was most evident in his role in the Battle of Badr. When the Quraysh prepared to confront the Muslims, Abu Jahl saw it as the final opportunity to stamp out the growing movement and restore the dominance of his tribe. The battle was not just a military engagement for him, it was a final stand to preserve everything he feared losing. His participation in the battle was not just about defeating an enemy, it was about quelling the threat to his personal and tribal authority. Despite his confidence in his army's numerical superiority, Abu Jahl's fear of the outcome was palpable. He knew that if the Quraysh lost, it would be a crushing blow to the Quraysh's power, and he would be left powerless. When the Muslims emerged victorious at Badr, Abu Jahl's fear became a reality. The defeat marked a significant shift in the balance of power in Mecca, and the death of Abu Jahl in the battle symbolized the downfall of a man who had built his life around the fear of losing power. His death was not just the death of an individual, but the collapse of an era where the Quraysh believed they were invincible. In many ways, Abu Jahl's fear of losing power blinded him to the broader changes occurring in the world, and ultimately it was his inability to adapt that led to his downfall. Abu Jahl, often remembered in history as one of the staunchest and most vehement opponents of Islam and Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, is largely characterized by his antagonism toward the new faith. However, there is a deeper, more nuanced side to his humanity that is rarely explored. Behind the image of the merciless Quraysh leader, there were personal struggles, insecurities, and aspects of his character that can shed light on the complexities of his actions and the social and political pressures that shaped his life. While he is most often associated with cruelty, pride, and opposition to change, this perspective fails to fully account for the intricate and multidimensional nature of his humanity. One of the key aspects of Abu Jahl's humanity that is often overlooked is his deep commitment to his tribe and the values he was raised with. Abu Jahl was a product of his time, his upbringing, and the socio-political system that defined Meccan society. The Quraysh were a proud and powerful tribe, deeply invested in the preservation of their customs and their control over the Kaaba, which was the religious and economic heart of Arabia. Abu Jahl, like many of his peers, had internalized these values and saw his role as a defender of his people's way of life. His fierce opposition to Islam was not merely out of personal malice toward Muhammad, PBUH, but because he truly believed that the Prophet's message would destabilize the entire structure of society, dismantling the traditional values that had sustained the Quraysh for generations. In his mind, he was doing what was necessary to protect his tribe, its traditions, and its position in the world. This commitment to his people was not an evil act, but one that was rooted in the preservation of what he believed was right and sacred. Abu Jahl was not a man devoid of empathy or emotion. There are moments in his life when he demonstrated care for his family and the people around him, revealing a more compassionate side. Like many powerful figures of his time, his acts of cruelty and harshness were often politically motivated, driven by the intense pressure of maintaining his social and political standing. His relationship with his family and his role as a protector of his tribe were in many ways just as important to him as his public persona. He did not live in a vacuum of hatred and cruelty. Rather, his actions were shaped by complex social dynamics and personal relationships that also played a significant role in his decision-making. This duality within his character, an individual capable of both cruelty and compassion, illustrates that he, too, was a human being struggling with his own beliefs, values, and limitations. Another aspect of Abu Jahl's humanity lies in his internal conflict. While he staunchly opposed the message of Islam, there were moments when his own doubts and questions about the faith must have surfaced. He was aware that the Prophet Muhammad was a man of high moral character, known for his integrity and honesty long before his prophethood. Abu Jahl, as a respected leader of the Quraysh, must have grappled with the notion that someone so revered could be the bearer of divine revelation. There are accounts that suggest that some members of the Quraysh, including Abu Jahl, were privately conflicted about Muhammad's message, but chose to publicly oppose him because of the immense social, political, and personal pressures to maintain the status quo. In many ways, Abu Jahl's rejection of Islam was not purely ideological, but also a means of holding on to his sense of security and position in a world that was rapidly changing. His pride, fear of losing power, and concern for his tribe's future overwhelmed whatever doubts he may have had about the truth of the Prophet's mission. Abu Jahl's humanity also can be viewed through the lens of his personal journey. He was not always the fierce antagonist we remember him as. In his early life, he would have been just another young man of the Quraysh, learning the ways of his people, with dreams and aspirations similar to those of his peers. However, as he rose to prominence, the pressures of leadership, the expectations of his tribe, and the challenges of protecting his family status began to shape him into a more hardened individual. The transformation from a man who may have once been more open-minded or flexible to one so rigid in his opposition to the Prophet Muhammad was driven by the intense loyalty he felt to the Quraysh and the fear of losing the identity and security that came with his position. The conflict within him must have been intense, the recognition of Muhammad as a truthful man versus the overwhelming drive to protect his tribe's supremacy. In the end, he chose to adhere to the latter, prioritizing his fear of losing power and his desire to maintain his social standing. In considering the untold side of Abu Jahl's humanity, it is important to remember that he, like all individuals, was shaped by his circumstances and environment. His actions and decisions were influenced by a combination of personal pride, tribal loyalty, fear, and a desire to preserve what he held dear. While his opposition to Islam and the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, ultimately led to his downfall and left a dark mark on his legacy, his life and actions also offer insight into the human condition, highlighting the internal struggles, fears, and motivations that drive individuals, even those on the wrong side of history. His story is not just one of hatred and opposition, but also a reflection of the complexities and contradictions that exist within all human beings, especially those who are caught in the turbulence of social, political, and religious upheaval. The legacy of Abu Jahl's opposition to Islam is one that is deeply ingrained in the history of early Islam, as his fierce resistance to the Prophet Muhammad left an indelible mark on the nascent Muslim community and its development. His actions, driven by a combination of personal pride, fear of losing power, and ideological conviction, not only made him one of the most prominent antagonists of Islam, but also symbolized the larger struggle between the forces of tradition and change that characterized the early days of the faith. Abu Jahl's legacy is a reflection of the broader challenges that Islam faced during its formative years, and it highlights the complex dynamics of opposition that shaped the trajectory of the religion. Abu Jahl's opposition to Islam was rooted in his belief that the Prophet Muhammad's PBUH message posed a direct threat to the social, political, and religious order that he and the Quraysh had long upheld. The Quraysh, as the custodians of the Kaaba and the leaders of Mecca, had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, which was centered around the polytheistic beliefs that governed their lives. Islam, with its monotheistic message and its emphasis on social justice and equality, was seen as a radical disruption to their authority and influence. Abu Jahl, as one of the chief leaders of the Quraysh, believed that the success of Islam would undermine not only the religious practices that defined Meccan identity, but also the economic and political dominance of his tribe. His determination to suppress the Prophet Muhammad and his followers, therefore, was not just a matter of personal animosity, but a deeply ingrained effort to protect his tribe's position in the Arabian Peninsula. One of the key aspects of Abu Jahl's opposition was his role in persecuting the early Muslims, using his influence and power to launch social and economic campaigns designed to isolate and weaken the fledgling community. His involvement in the boycott of the Muslims, which aimed to cut them off from trade, sustenance, and social connections, demonstrated his commitment to using any means necessary to force the Muslims into submission. The boycott, which lasted for years, was a brutal attempt to break the spirit of the Muslims and convince them to abandon their faith. While the boycott ultimately failed, it highlighted Abu Jahl's willingness to go to great lengths, including imposing collective punishment on the innocent, in order to extinguish what he viewed as a threat to his tribe's power. Abu Jahl's legacy is also marked by his role in the Battle of Badr, where he was a key figure leading the Quraysh forces against the Muslims. His leadership in the battle, driven by both a desire for revenge and a determination to preserve the dominance of the Quraysh, ended in his defeat and death. The loss at Badr was a significant blow to the Quraysh, both militarily and psychologically, and Abu Jahl's death symbolized the failure of his efforts to crush Islam through violence and force. The victory of the Muslims at Badr was not just a military success. It was a turning point in the history of Islam, marking the beginning of the Muslim community's resilience and ability to stand against overwhelming odds. Abu Jahl's death served as a potent reminder that no matter how powerful or influential a person may be, the cause of truth and righteousness will ultimately prevail, regardless of the opposition. The legacy of Abu Jahl's opposition also extends beyond his personal actions and death. His fierce resistance to Islam became a symbol for the Quraysh and others who would later oppose the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, and his message. He embodied the archetype of the arrogant and proud leader who sought to maintain control at all costs, even if it meant opposing the truth and persecuting the innocent. His opposition inspired others within the Quraysh to take a similar stance against Islam, and his harsh tactics of ridicule, social exclusion, and violence set a precedent for those who followed in his footsteps. As a result, Abu Jahl's actions played a pivotal role in shaping the early challenges faced by the Muslim community, and his opposition became a defining feature of the struggle for the survival of Islam in the face of overwhelming odds. The legacy of Abu Jahl's opposition also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride, arrogance, and fear of change. His refusal to accept the message of Islam was not only a rejection of the Prophet Muhammad, but also an embodiment of the human tendency to resist change, especially when it threatens deeply held beliefs and established power structures. Abu Jahl's opposition was driven by a deep-seated fear of losing control and status, which ultimately led to his downfall. His life and actions remind us of the destructive power of stubbornness and the inability to adapt to new truths. In contrast, the success of Islam, despite the intense opposition it faced, highlights the resilience and strength of faith and how those who stand for truth will ultimately triumph, even in the face of the most powerful opposition. Abu Jahl's legacy also has a significant place in Islamic thought and theology. While he is remembered as a staunch enemy of Islam, his role in the early years of the faith serves as a powerful example of how those who oppose the truth are ultimately defeated, regardless of their strength or influence. In Islamic tradition, Abu Jahl's name is synonymous with arrogance, pride, and opposition to divine guidance, and his actions are used as a warning for those who might stand in the way of righteousness. His legacy serves as a reminder that no matter how formidable the opposition may seem, the power of truth and justice will eventually prevail, as demonstrated by the triumph of Islam over the forces that sought to suppress it. In sum, the legacy of Abu Jahl's opposition to Islam is multifaceted, encompassing both the personal consequences of his actions and the broader impact they had on the early Muslim community. His relentless resistance to the Prophet Muhammad and his efforts to suppress Islam shaped the early struggles of the faith and left a lasting impression on the history of Islam. His actions serve as both a symbol of the challenges Islam faced and a warning against the dangers of pride, fear, and the resistance to change. In conclusion, Abu Jahl's legacy, though often defined by his fierce opposition to Islam, offers profound insights into the complexities of human nature, the struggles for power, and the resilience of truth. His actions, driven by fear of losing his status and a deeply ingrained attachment to his tribal identity, shaped the early challenges faced by the Muslim community. Despite his power, his relentless resistance ultimately could not prevent the rise of Islam, serving as a poignant reminder that even the most formidable forces of opposition are ultimately overpowered by truth and righteousness. Abu Jahl's story is not merely one of antagonism, but also one that reflects the broader human tendency to resist change and the ultimate triumph of faith over pride and arrogance. The history of his opposition continues to inspire reflection on the nature of power, resistance, and the enduring power of truth, reminding